What if I told you that every quit smoking ad paid for by Big Tobacco was a chess move in a much larger game? A game not just to survive, but to evolve, to adapt, and to win. So sit back. Let's light a match. Not a cigarette, just the truth.
Hi, Nick Adams. You light up your cigarette? Here's mine. If yours isn't an L&M, bet your mine tastes better. Reach for L&M.
The cigarette. A slender cylinder of dried leaves and promise. Once wrapped in elegance. Once cradled by the lips of movie stars and war heroes. It whispered sophistication, daring, allure, a prop as much as a product. In the 1920s and 30s, smoking wasn't just a habit. It was an identity. A rebellion curled in smoke. A signal, of class, of charisma, of control. You didn't just light a cigarette. You lit a statement. The silver screen made it gospel. Bogart's smoldering stare behind a trail of smoke. Audrey Hepburn's long holder in hand, poised, divine. Soldiers returning from war, cigarette dangling like a badge of grit. The world followed. And behind that cultural wildfire, a carefully orchestrated campaign, not just of marketing, but of manipulation. The medical profession, once expected to warn against harm, became unwitting endorsers. More doctors smoked Camels than any other cigarette, the ads declared. They wore white coats and gentle smiles, lending trust to a habit that would go on to kill millions. And people believed them. Why wouldn't they? The science was still young, the illusion still intact. By the 1950s, the deception had taken deep root. Nearly half of all American adults smoked, not occasionally, but daily. Cigarettes were everywhere, in offices. In airplanes. In hospitals. Even in schools, teachers lighting up in break rooms, students sneaking puffs behind gymnasiums. Behind this smoky curtain stood titans. Not men, but corporations, industrial empires with a singular goal, keep the world smoking. Philip Morris, cloaking addiction in Marlboro's rugged charm. The cowboy, silent, stoic, invincible. A marketing mirage masking lung disease beneath leather and sunlight. R.J. Reynolds, giving Camel a voice. A smirk. A swagger. Joe Camel, cartoonish, cool, unforgettable, luring not just adults but children, intentionally blurring the line between fun and fatal. British American Tobacco, quietly expanding from London to Lagos, placing cigarettes in markets hungry for Western modernity, even if it meant death by the carton. Japan Tobacco International, unfurling their brand across Asia, riding the tide of globalization to flood cities with smoke, from Tokyo to Bangkok. Their business model was simple: get people hooked. Hook them young. And never, ever let them go. Nicotine wasn't just an ingredient. It was the hook in the mouth, the chain on the wrist. Where regulations threatened them, they lobbied. Where truth emerged, they buried it. Where lawsuits loomed, they delayed, denied, and deflected. Decade after decade, they played a game of shadows, denying, distracting, rebranding. But smoke, as you'll soon see, can only hide so much. Eventually, it clears. And what's revealed is not just an industry, but an empire built on breathlessness. Then came the whisper. A quiet, unsettling truth murmured in labs and hospitals: cigarettes cause cancer. At first, the industry laughed, smug, untouchable, armored by decades of public trust and profit. Then, they panicked. In 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General released a bombshell report that would change the landscape forever: smoking was directly linked to lung cancer, heart disease, and early death. Let me give you a very brief summary of one way smoking cigarettes can lead to cancer. Cigarette smoke contains around 7,000 chemicals, of which more than 70 are known carcinogens, including benzo, A, pyrene, a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, and tobacco-specific nitrosamine S. When inhaled, these toxins enter lung cells and undergo detoxification, especially via cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver and lungs. But this process produces reactive metabolites, epoxides, carbocations, that bind DNA and form DNA adducts, disrupting the genome. These carcinogens preferentially damage guanine, G, DNA bases, leading to a telltale GT transversion mutation pattern, widely recognized in smokers' lung tumors. Critical tumor suppressor genes like TP53 often harbor these exact mutations, directly linking smoking-related DNA damage to uncontrolled cell growth. Over years, small mutated cell groups gain superpowers, resisting death, multiplying endlessly, and invading new tissue, becoming cancer. Toxic carcinogens are absorbed into the bloodstream, affecting bladder, throat, mouth, esophagus, and even colorectal, pancreatic, liver, kidney, cervical cancers, and leukemia. You might expect cigarette companies to pause, to reflect, to pivot. But they didn't. They chose a different path. They lied, systematically, strategically. Internal memos uncovered decades later revealed their true mindset. "Doubt is our product," one tobacco executive wrote in 1969, "since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists." With those words, a new strategy was born, not to refute the science, but to muddy the waters. To blur the lines between truth and uncertainty. They created fake research groups dressed in the illusion of credibility. They paid scientists under the table to sow confusion. They launched PR campaigns not to inform, but to deceive. And when summoned before Congress, the most powerful men in tobacco stood, suited, solemn, swearing under oath that nicotine wasn't addictive.
Let me begin my questioning on the matter of whether or not nicotine is addictive. Let me ask you first, and I'd like to just go down the row, whether each of you believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it, and just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no, and again, time is short. If you could just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
All right.
They said it with a straight face. They said it knowing full well what they were doing. Because behind closed doors, their laboratories were cooking up a darker secret. They were manipulating the chemical makeup of cigarettes to make them even more addictive. More nicotine. Faster absorption. Deeper dependency. This wasn't business anymore. This was warfare. And the battlefield wasn't land or oil, it was public health. Millions would pay the price. But the companies? They just kept counting the profits, hiding behind clouds of calculated doubt. But eventually, truth clawed its way through the smoke. It didn't arrive with a bang but with a leak, a flood of internal documents in the 1990s that peeled back the curtain and exposed what the industry had long buried. The lies, the manipulation, the cold calculations. The public finally saw it for what it was. Lawsuits erupted across the United States. State after state dragged big tobacco into court, demanding accountability, not just for the cigarettes sold, but for the hospital bills paid, the families shattered, the decades of deception woven into the fabric of society. The industry was cornered, but it didn't fold. It negotiated. It orchestrated a response, a deal that was less a confession and more a masterstroke of legal theater. In 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement was signed. 4 of the biggest players in tobacco, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Lorillard, and Brown and Williamson, agreed to pay a staggering $206 billion over 25 years. On paper, it was a reckoning. In reality, it was a recalibration. Along with the payout came restrictions. They were banned from advertising to children. Joe Camel, the smooth-talking, cartoon mascot that had slipped into the minds of millions of kids, was gone. No more sponsorships on race cars. No more candy-flavored cigarettes that tasted like cherry but killed like poison. No more billboards towering over schoolyards with glossy promises of cool. And in a twist so rich in irony it bordered on satire, these same companies were now required to fund anti-smoking campaigns. They had to bankroll public service announcements warning people not to use the very product they spent decades pushing. It was as if the arsonist had been forced to pay for the fire truck, not because he was sorry, but because he'd been caught. But here's the thing. It wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic retreat. Because while the West was tightening its grip, the rest of the world was still wide open. New markets. New targets. New lungs to conquer. So now, the very companies that spent decades selling death began paying millions to help you quit. They produced commercials that could bring tears to your eyes, blackened lungs on X-rays, hospital beds surrounded by grieving children, last words murmured between beeps of a heart monitor. It looked like remorse. It felt like redemption. But that's where the magic trick begins. Because not all quit smoking ads are actually designed to help you quit. Some were crafted to shock you, to paralyze you with fear, but conveniently left out the part where you could actually do something about it. Others painted quitting as a hopeless, uphill battle, a journey so grueling and agonizing that most smokers would rather stay put than take the first step. They spoke of willpower like it was the only key, subtly reinforcing the idea that if you couldn't quit, it was because you were weak. What they didn't talk about were the things that actually help, the nicotine patches, the support groups, the counseling, the medications backed by science. They didn't highlight tools, they highlighted tombstones. Even the imagery was strategic, the hacking coughs, the operating rooms, the funeral scenes. Those weren't just warnings. They were stress triggers. And for smokers, stress is a cue, a reason to light up, not to put it down. It's clever, really. The illusion of advocacy. The performance of concern. But the message hiding behind the smoke wasn't, you can quit. It was, you can't. And when the smoker fails, when they reach for another cigarette after trying to stop, the blame doesn't fall on the billion-dollar industry that addicted them in the first place. No, the blame falls neatly, quietly, squarely on the smoker. But they didn't stop there. Because big tobacco never stops. When cigarette sales started to decline, when the lawsuits piled up, the warning labels grew larger, and society began to turn its back on smoking, the industry didn't retreat. It did what it has always done best, adapt. They saw the writing on the wall, clear as day. Governments were tightening regulations. Advertising bans were spreading. Taxes were rising. Public opinion was shifting. Smoking was no longer seen as cool or rebellious, it was a liability, a relic of a more naive time. People were quitting. But quitting what, exactly? Because nicotine, not smoke, was always the lifeline of this industry. And so, just as the cigarette once rose to replace the cigar, a new era dawned, not to end addiction, but to reinvent it. They called them alternatives. Safer. Cleaner. More modern. First came vapes, colorful, compact, and flavored like candy and bubble gum. They didn't smell like cigarettes. They didn't leave ash. You could sneak them in schools, puff discreetly in bedrooms, and parents might not even notice. But the nicotine? Still there. Still potent. Still addictive. Then came nicotine patches and lozenges, promoted as quit aids, yet now sold by the very companies that once claimed nicotine wasn't addictive. The irony was bitter, but the business was booming. Next up were the so-called innovations, heat-not-burn devices like Philip Morris's IQOS. They didn't burn tobacco, they claimed they heated it. Less smoke, fewer toxins, a technological marvel. Advertised not just as a product, but as a revolution, smoke-free future, they called it, as if they'd suddenly grown a conscience. Nicotine pouches like ZYN entered the chat, little white packets tucked under the lip, giving users a clean, smokeless, spit-free buzz, perfect for the boardroom, the classroom, or anywhere else nicotine was once taboo. All of it sold under the illusion of progress. A way out. A ladder from the pit of addiction. But look closely and you'll see, the ladder goes in a circle. The companies that once addicted the world to cigarettes were now rebranding themselves as wellness allies. Altria, once known as Philip Morris, bought a massive stake in JUUL, the vape brand that surged in popularity among teens. Philip Morris International launched IQOS, wrapped in sleek white packaging and minimalist fonts, and called it smoke-free innovation. British American Tobacco rolled out Vuse, a high-tech vape, and slapped a new slogan on their empire, a better tomorrow. It was marketing brilliance, and moral theater. Because these weren't really off-ramps. They were roundabouts. You weren't quitting nicotine. You were just switching uniforms. Redecorating your addiction in cooler colors and smoother delivery systems. A cigarette by any other name still hooks the same. And guess what? The profits soared. Far from fading, the tobacco industry found new life, newer, younger users, longer lifespans for addiction, fewer regulations to navigate. From combustible to rechargeable, from Marlboro Reds to mango pods and mint pouches, the business of addiction didn't die. It evolved. And behind every fruity flavor and sleek device, the same playbook remained: hook, retain, profit, repeat. While Western countries tightened the noose, banning advertisements, slapping graphic warnings on cigarette packs, raising taxes, and launching aggressive anti-smoking campaigns, Big Tobacco didn't slow down. It simply shifted focus. Its eyes turned southward. Toward the global south. Toward Africa, Asia, and Latin America, regions rich with people, possibility, and above all, untapped lungs. These were places where regulations were weak or poorly enforced. Where public health systems were underfunded. Where governments, often under pressure from foreign investors and lobbyists, had little will or means to fight back. Places where Big Tobacco could still operate like it was the 1950s, freely, openly, and with impunity. In these regions, the Marlboro Man still rides tall on billboards. Camels and Winstons still flash across television screens. Tobacco stands proudly sponsor music festivals, sports events, and school scholarships. Branded tents are handed out in markets. Free cigarette samples land in the hands of teenagers. Nigeria, Indonesia, Pakistan, Kenya, the list goes on. These nations became ground zero for Big Tobacco's second act. Factories were built on their soil, promising jobs while pushing poisons. Politicians were courted and campaigns funded. Laws were softened or stalled entirely. All under the guise of foreign investment and economic growth. In Indonesia, children as young as 8 are seen puffing on Kretek cigarettes while the government defends the tobacco industry as vital to the economy. In Nigeria, flashy ads and price discounts continue to lure first-time smokers, many of them teens. In Pakistan, warning labels are smaller and less prominent, and enforcement of age restrictions is virtually non-existent. And in Kenya, despite some of the strongest tobacco control laws on paper, enforcement is so weak that cigarette companies still find ways to sponsor concerts and influence local leaders. While they lost ground in New York, London, and Paris, they gained ground, and profits, in Jakarta, Lagos, Karachi, and Nairobi. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't desperation. This was a cold, calculated pivot. A strategic migration. They knew exactly what they were doing, following the path of least resistance, targeting places where public awareness was low and government pushback was even lower. In many ways, it was the same old fire, just burning in new places. And thanks to that strategy, the flame didn't fade. It spread. And now, the final act in this grand illusion, a twist so bold, so brazen, it borders on satire. What if I told you that some of the world's biggest tobacco companies, the same ones who spent decades fueling a global health crisis, are now rebranding themselves as saviors? That they're not just selling nicotine, but now also selling the cure. Take Philip Morris International, for example. This is the company behind Marlboro, one of the most iconic cigarette brands in history. In 2021, they acquired Vectura, a pharmaceutical company that manufactures inhalers, yes, inhalers, the very devices used by asthma and COPD patients whose lungs are often ravaged by years of smoking. The backlash from health professionals was immediate. But the acquisition went through. The irony, intentional or not, was undeniable. And they didn't stop there. Big Tobacco has invested in companies that produce nicotine gums and lozenges, marketed not as nicotine products but as therapeutic aids. They've poured money into smoking cessation apps, health tech platforms designed to guide users through the process of quitting, all while still making billions from the addictive product they need help quitting in the first place. It's as if the arsonist has returned to the scene with a fire extinguisher and a bill. Imagine a firefighter who lights the blaze, then shows up in uniform to sell you the hose, the water, and the fire insurance. That's the model. That's the game now. They don't just want to own the addiction. They want to own the recovery too. Control every step of the journey, from the spark, to the smoke, to the salvation. From the product that harms you to the medicine that treats you. From the first puff to the final patch. It's not just about cigarettes anymore. It's about building a full-spectrum empire, one that profits from both your dependence and your escape. An endless loop of suffering and solution, all conveniently packaged under the same corporate umbrella. And the most chilling part? Most people don't even realize it's happening. Because the smoke may have cleared, but the illusion? That still lingers.